Okay, thank you to everybody for joining. I'm sorry that we missed a week. I had a case of strep. Baruch Hashem, I'm better now. And we can continue where we left off. Now, last week we spoke about Keriat HaTorah. The last class, I should say, 2 weeks ago. We finished off our discussion of Keriat HaTorah in medieval times, and we discussed the major changes that occurred in the early Middle Ages, all the way through until roughly the 15th century. The three primary changes we looked at were A, the dissolution and the eventual extinction of the practice to have a Miturgaman. We looked at the extinction of the practice to keep the Torah in a triennial cycle, to read it instead of reading the Torah once a year and splitting it into 45 sections. We would read it throughout 3 years. And that was the Minhag in Eretz Yisrael, the triennial cycle to do it once every 3 years, and split it into Sidrot instead of Parshiot. And we discussed how that Minhag eventually also fell away with the decline of the Yeshivot of Eretz Yisrael. And lastly, we discussed the formation of this role that we know of today, the Baal Koreh, because in their times, in the early Middle Ages, up until probably the 13th century, it was much more common for the average man to be prepared and to be ready to read at the Torah on his own. And he would be ready to read without any assistance. However, over time, the Shliach Tzibur became the main reader for the community. And this role in the community and the Keilah of a Baal Koreh was formed with its own halachic intricacies, of course, because this is not pashut. It's not taken for granted that somebody else could read for you and you're the one making the bracha. However, already by the time of the 16th century, the Shulchan Aruch affixed this as normative, and most communities today still use a Baal Koreh instead of allowing the Oleh himself, allowing the person who does the Aliyah to read for everybody else. And unfortunately, today we don't have the same knowledge. We're not as prepared as people were. Tonight, we're going to discuss broadly, very broadly, the history of Keriat HaTorah in the modern era, meaning in the past 500 years or so, and how it developed. What were the major changes to Keriat HaTorah in the past 500 years? And frankly, when it comes to the bones of this system and how Keriat HaTorah should work in general, the truth is not much has changed. When you look at the evidence you have from the poskim and the evidence you have from the Sidurim, it doesn't seem like much has changed in the past 500 years. There's still the basic bones of the structure are the same. Yes, in the past 500 years, we have a different selection, maybe perhaps a slightly different collection of Pisukim, which are read when they take out a Sefer Torah. And they've added, especially in the past 500 years, more Pisukim to say when you put back the Sefer Torah. But be that as it may, the actual bones for how we do Keriat HaTorah are essentially the same. Now, researching this period is exacerbated by a very interesting problem, and that is that understanding how the modern period was shaped by the medieval period gets tough, since in the medieval period, a lot of our evidence is based on manuscripts. And you have at least the Ashkenazi, in the Ashkenazi repertoire, we have a lot of Ashkenazi Sidurim. The Sfaradim, we don't have as many. But in the Sidurim themselves, very few of them actually spell out exactly what should be done by Keriat HaTorah. Most of them just have like very succinct instructions, and they don't put too much material. By the modern era, as paper becomes cheaper and printing becomes more affordable, over time, over the 16th century and a little further, we begin to see more elaborate sections on Keriat HaTorah because they could afford the ink, and frankly, they could afford the extra place to tell us what they are saying and why they are doing it. Besides for that manuscript evidence, we have to basically use indirect evidence of what the Paiskim are saying. Now, it doesn't always reflect reality. Even what's in the Siddur doesn't always reflect reality. But building on and understanding the changes from the medieval period to the modern period are a little tricky because not everything that's in the Sidurim, whether they're handwritten or printed, reflect what was actually done in practice. What we do understand from the halachic literature is that the bones of the system are basically the same. We don't have meturgamanim. We don't have, a triennial cycle. Most of the bones of the system remain the same. It is possible, this is something Ruth Langer points out, that the attitudes towards Keriat HaTorah evolved, but for the most part, I should say, for the most part, Keriat HaTorah remained a fairly recognizable ritual for somebody over the past 500 years. Now, be that as it may, tonight what I want to discuss are some of the major outliers in this history, beginning with the practice of Berich Shemeih. Now, Berich Shemeih is one of those tefillot which probably gets the most the most misunderstood. The origin of Berich Shemeih is a mystery, but we do have to begin with one major fact, and that is that although Berich Shemeih is in Aramaic, and the Sidurim claim that it's in the Zohar, and if you open up a Zohar Vayakal, you're going to see it there. The truth is, Berich Shemeih is not from the Zohar. Now, this is a fact that has become more and more known slowly to scholars of liturgy over the past decade or so, but it was most pronounced by a scholar named Professor Dr. Avishai Bar Asher from Hebrew University in Eretz Yisrael. He published an article in 2018 in the Tarbis magazine outlining his evidence for this fact. And it was slowly realized that if you look up the old Zohar manuscripts, the vast majority of them do not have anything like Berich Shemeih. You see, the section in Zohar by Vayakel, where we find Berich Shemeih today, that section, the Zohar is talking about all the things, the proper ritual and the proper decorum for how people should practice Keriat HaTorah on Shabbat. That's what the Zohar is talking about. And none of the major manuscripts of Zohar contain anything like Berich Shemeih, at least the Berich Shemeih that we know. There was one or two manuscripts, probably one from Tzifat specifically, where at the bottom of the manuscript of the Zohar, somebody added in this Aramaic prayer. This said, and he says, when a person opens the Heichal, Kad Mafkin Oraita, that have Aramaic instructions, when a person opens the Heichal, they should say this prayer. And it was written in on the bottom. Similarly, from the mid-1400s, we have Sidurim from the 15th century from Italy, which already have Berich Shemeih. Now, this is almost 100 years before the Zohar was ever put into print, was ever put into the printing house. We have Sidurim, which contain Berich Shemeih from Italy that predate even the printing of the Zohar. Now, how did this one addendum, this marginal item, get into the main body of text of the Zohar? It would seem that the Italian text, or the text from Tzifat, which had the Zohar, had this little prayer added because somebody felt like it was appropriate. Listen, we have this Aramaic prayer we say by Keriat HaTorah. We don't know where it's from. We have this Aramaic prayer. Probably we should put it on the bottom of the whole list in the Zohar, where it has a list of what to do on Shabbat, Keriat HaTorah. However, what happened was that the printers added it in small text in the first printing of Zohar. And then in the subsequent printings of Zohar, they just put it in full-size font. And then everybody thought it was part of the Zohar, and somebody added the words Amar Rabbi Shimon, as if in the middle of an entire section where Rabbi Yitzchak is talking, as if Amar Rabbi Shimon, as if he suddenly interjects. And somebody added that in, and now suddenly everybody thinks the Berich Shemeih is from the Zohar. I will show you one fascinating siddur. This is an Italian siddur from roughly the 15th or 16th centuries. This is in the Russian Academy of Sciences, St. Petersburg. If you look here, you'll see the tefillat, the Berich Shemeih down here. But Berich Shemeih has one tremendous, nice, big attribution. Tefillah leharamban. It does not attribute it to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It doesn't attribute it to the Zohar. Instead, it says that this is a tefillah that the Ramban wrote. Kadmafki sifrado, right? Right? No, Amar Rabbi Shimon. And then finally, Berich Shemeih, Demare Alma Brich Kitrach Ve'atrach. Now, was it the Ramban who wrote this? Was the Ramban the one who wrote Berich Shemeih? It's possible. I mean, it's not impossible. We don't have any corroborating evidence from Spain. Nobody in Spain ever mentions that the Ramban wrote this tefillah for saying Keriat HaTorah. What we have here from Italy is probably somebody trying to attribute the tefillah to the Ramban because he felt like this tefillah was Kabbalistic. That's what most probably is happening, but it is also possible that indeed this is a tefillah that was written by the Ramban. Now, already the early commentators of the Zohar, like the Ramak, they already say that the Berich Shemeih has no business being inside the Zohar. They say some people put this memory here as if like he had one manuscript that was like that. Like the Ramak says this does not belong here. The Ramak does not say that it's not Zoharic. He doesn't say that this is not part of the Zohar. He just says it doesn't belong here. And many of the commentators say the same thing. However, later study has shown that it probably is not from the Zohar. First of all, the language is just far too Palestinian. It's much too JPA, Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. It doesn't really reflect the unique style of Babylonian Aramaic that you find in the regular Zohar text. It's much more similar, for example, to the Aramaic that you would find in Targum Yerushalmi or Targum Yonatan. It does not, for example, ever say Amar Rabbi Shimon in the original text of Berich Shemeih. And furthermore, it just has no mysticism. There's no Zoharic theosophy. There's no there's no theurgy. There's no like this is not the way the Zohar typically thinks or talks. If you look at the Berich Shemeih, it is spiritual, but it's not the kind of spiritual system or mystical system that you would expect from a Zoharic text. And most of the commentators struggle to even explain it as being a Zoharic text. So it's very unlikely that it is a text from the Zohar. So, okay, let's just recap for a second. In the 1400s, we have Sidurim. Some say it's a tefillah from the Ramban, and they have Berich Shemeih. In the early 1500s, somebody sticks it into manuscripts of the Zohar, and then everybody thinks it's from the Zohar. Once everybody thinks it's from the Zohar, all the Sidurim go wild, and all the Mikubalim go wild, and they say this is very important to say, and because it's from the Zohar, Shar Kavanos says that his Rebbe or the Arizal used to say it on Shabbat morning when they open the Heichal. Beautiful. So all the Saradim today still do it. Especially the Moroccans will only do it on Shabbat morning the way the Arizal did it as well. Now, that explains the history, of course, with the canonicity of the Zohar and the acceptance of the Zohar as a canon text. Eventually this became just the mainstay, and eventually even in like the 18th centuries, I think maybe even in the 17th century, the Ashkenazim began to say it as well. Berich Shemeih became a major part of the Keriat HaTorah, and that is I should say the Keriat HaTorah ritual, the liturgy. Berich Shemeih became a part and parcel. But this is kind of astounding because we have no idea where this tefillah comes from. If it's not from the Zohar, who wrote it and where does it come from? And the answer is we just don't know. Why did he write it in Aramaic? Who wrote it in Aramaic? And where was it written? I wish I had an answer for you, but we do have a clue. One of the clues is a sefer called Sefer Orchot Chaim from Aaron Milunil. Aaron Milunil was a Provençal Rishon who lived in the 13th century. And he says as follows: when we say Baruch Hu, right? If you open up an Ashkenaz Siddur, you'll find some Sephardi Siddurim, you'll find that when you're saying Baruch Hu by davening, when the Chazan says Baruch Hu, he is supposed to say it long and slow, and everybody is supposed to say Yisparach v'Yisramam v'Yisaseh v'Yishadar, right? If you open an ArtScroll Siddur, in case you've never seen it before, your eyes have glossed over it, trust me, open your ArtScroll Siddur, look at Baruch Hu by Shachris and by Ma'ariv, and you'll see that there's a little section you're supposed to say while the Chazan is saying Baruch Hu. This was the minhag all the way since the time of the early Rishonim, and it eventually just fell into disuse for some reason. Now, the earliest versions of this tefillah that are said during Baruch Hu didn't begin with Yisbarach, with Ala Kol Yisbarach. Instead, they began with Baruchi Nafshi et Hashem, especially if you look at Machzor Vitri and places like that. However, The Minhag Provence was a little bit different. Let's look at the Orchot Chaim. Upoteach HaChazan B'Kol Ram. The Chazan begins out loud and he says, Baruch Hu et Hashem HaMevorach. V'korea beBaruch Hu, and he v'zokef b'Shem. You bow by Baruch Hu and you stand up straight b'Shem. U'beha'ari chobo, and as he is saying it in a long fashion, so that people have time to pray to say this silently, HaKahal Yomru B'Lachash, the congregation should silently recite, Berich Shemeih D'marei Alma, Baruchi Nafshi et Hashem v'chol krovai, at Shem Kodsho, if I'm remembering the pasuk correctly. We have here from southern France something very interesting. And Professor Avishai Bar Asher thought when he saw this, he's like, well, first of all, this is interesting. Somebody came up with this language. Maybe it's something like a Aramaic way of saying Baruch Shem Kol Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. But when he looked at this, he thought maybe this is like, perhaps this is an option, like either you say Berich Shemeih D'marei Alma or you say Baruchi Nafshi, but it's not entirely clear from the text. And then what does Rav Aaron Milunel say in the Orchot Chaim? What does he continues to say? K'moshe mefurash b'sidrei tefilot, as you find in the Sidurim. And afterwards you continue with Baruch Hashem Mevorach Le'olam Va'ed. Fascinating. What did they say? We don't know. Now, Professor Bar Asher himself didn't know of a Sidur where it said Berich Shemeih, in this fashion. He was aware that, Maksuvitri and the other sources from Ashkenaz and the Rhineland did have a tefillah beginning with Baruchi Nafshi, but he didn't know of a Siddur like this. However, because I saw that the Orchot Chaim says, as it says in the Sidurim, I went to the website from the National Library of Israel. They have a database called Ketiv. Ketiv is a almost like a single repository of every digitized manuscript in Hebrew that exists on the planet, right? Whether it's manuscript or printed, everything that's on the planet, whether it's in British Library, Russian State Library, Library of Congress, wherever it is, if it's digitized or if it's in a catalog, it'll be inside Ketiv, especially if it's a manuscript. And I filtered by Provençal Sidurim that from the Middle Ages. And what I found was really interesting. I found two Sidurim from Provence, which actually have it exactly the way the Orchos Chaim says it. And I'm sorry if my screen is blocking here, but if you could read, this French handwriting is kind of difficult. But the first line here, Berich Shemeih D'marei Alma, LeDavid Baruchu Nafshi et Hashem v'chol krovai et Shem Kodsho. I don't know if you could see the second line and third line here. Furthermore, the next manuscript is over here. Berich Shemeih D'marei Alma. It doesn't say Berich Yehei, but it says Berich Shemeih D'marei Alma Baruchi Nafshi et Hashem. So I actually sent it. I emailed Professor Bar Asher this week. He was kind enough to reply. And he was happy to find this. He had never seen this before. So we're lucky we found it. I hope there's something that we could do with this information. As he noted to me, he said it would be much more interesting to see if the descendants of the Provençal communities, in the French communities, like Asti Fosani Asti, I'm sorry, I forgot the names, Moncalvo and Afam, the Minhag Afam. If those three communities also would have had some derivative of this. I think the latest Provençal Sidur I saw only began with Baruchi Nafshi and didn't say Berich Shemeih at the beginning. Regardless, this is a clue. It's a very odd prayer, though. If you think about it, it's kind of clunky. You say Berich Shemeih D'marei Alma LeDavid Baruchi Nafshi et Hashem. Like, is it an abbreviation to say Berich Shemeih? Like, what exactly is going on? Why would they say this prayer by Baruch Hu? So Professor Bar Asher has this hypothesis, and I think it's a good hypothesis, that when people bowed, they were used to, and at least in Provence, they were used to saying a prayer that began with the words Berich Shemeih. So because they were used to saying a prayer that began with the words Berich Shemeih when they were bowing for Baruch Hu, also when they opened up the Sefer Torah, somebody wrote a prayer for opening the Heichal that began with Berich Shemeih, because there was a minhag for people to bow when the Sefer Torah was opened. Now, I think it's a very healthy hypothesis. It's a good theory. I'm not 100% sold on it because, there's too many other possibilities as well. Um, and I would encourage anybody to see his article in Tarbit. My only uh, uh, I would call it comment on that article would be that I think his comparisons to the Lord's Prayer, to the Paternoster, is a little bit ambitious. It's my personal opinion. I think he goes a little far in the Berich Shemeih analysis. Overall, comparing it to Targum Yonasan and Uziel, I find very convincing. I find that those ideas are very much, what do you call it? The ideas can very much be traced to Targum Yonatan. But to compare it to the Lord's Prayer, I think is a little bit ambitious. I'll leave that at that. Let's continue with past Berich Shemeih. Berich Shemeih, again, is one of the major parts, one of the major additions to the ritual in the modern era. But there are many more, of course. I mean, there's I would recommend. I want to talk a little bit more of them at the very end. But you know what? I guess we could talk about this now. Why not? There's an important piece by. Let me just talk about this right now because I think we should go into it a little bit more. Perhaps if we have time next week. Ruth Langer has a book called Liturgy in the Life, and Stephen Fine. They have a book called Liturgy in the Life of the Synagogue. And in this book, she has an article about how in the past 500 years, the liturgy in Ashkenaz developed around the ritual of taking out the Sefer Torah. Not just the 500 years, really in the past 1,000 years, to be honest. And she looks at precisely exactly which Pesukim we have evidence for in the Sidurim for what people would say when they would take out the Sefer Torah and put it back in. Now, this is highly technical because you have to go through every quarter of a century or so and look at the Sidurim and how they developed. And in my own lifetime, just explain this. In my own lifetime, I've seen disparities between what is actually printed in the Sidur and what people will actually do. Simply because the songs change, right? If you're in a Sephardi shul, there's only two songs, right? There's the Hashrei Ha'am Shekachalo, or there's Ashrei Ha'am Shekachalo. Like you have these two popular songs, and those are the dominant ones. But based on how good the people are at singing, you'll see how many Pesukim people actually say. Based on what kind of shul you're in, you'll find confusing conglomerations of different minhagim. So the Sidur itself, what you find in the Sidur versus what people claim to be the practice of a locality is not always accurate. The bones of the system are the same. Essentially, what we find is that from the time of Masechet Sofrim onwards, when you open up the Heichal, we say a florilegium. That's one of her favorite words. You say a collection of verses that are stringed together that speak about the greatness of Hashem, because it seems that from Masechet Sofrim, it seems that the it seems that the emphasis when we open the Heichal should be that we are worshiping Hashem, not the Torah. So we say a lot of Pesukim about Hashem, but tracing these Pesukim, she sees if you look at the content of the Pesukim and what they chose, she sees this as a way of tracing the zeitgeist of every century in the past 500 years. You could see how sometimes people were very into the revelation of Har Sinai, and sometimes people were very into the returning to Tzion. And I find these ideas interesting. I haven't gotten to the whole article, so I can't critique it at all. But I'm hesitant on the whole premise, simply because I find in my own personal life, I've found that the Pesukim and the rituals around Sefer Torah are ever changing and ever fluid. And I don't find that the Sidurim themselves are very good witnesses to exactly what the ritual is or exactly what the attitudes are of the Kehillah. That's my personal life opinion. I will, God willing, if we continue on this topic, I will have more to say on this matter. But again, there's been a lot of nuance change in the past 500 years, but it's only on finer details. It's not usually on the bones of the system. The bones of the system are basically the same. Now, one remarkable change in the past 200 years, I should say, that occurred for Keriat HaTorah is the revival of the triennial cycle. And I'm going to quote here for you Rabbi Reuven Silverman, the Reform rabbi of Manchester Row Synagogue. He wrote this article on the internet in 2017, and he says, One of the biggest mistakes in the history of Judaism was to change from a triennial to an annual cycle of the Torah readings. Fortunately, Reform Judaism revived a triennial system. What he's alluding to here is something that if you're Orthodox, you'll have no idea exists. But in 1845, there was a famous conference, rabbinical conference in Frankfurt, of a bunch of Reform rabbis who came together to kind of decide what a Reform liturgy should be and what the new rules and the new form and the new look of a Reform liturgy, the attitudes and the guide for a new Reform liturgy should be. They had a number of questions posed to the committee. They had a lot of contentious fights over what should be and how a Reform liturgy should look. There were, I should say, a couple of things that they all agreed on, though. For example, they all agreed that you should get rid of Chazar Shashatz. Get rid of that. it's because what they cared about most was decorum. And Chazar Shashatz was one of those things that was a very big problem for decorum in shuls, and it still is to this day. Another thing they all agreed on was to get rid of the annual Torah reading where you have to read the entire parasha. Why? Because, well, if you've ever been to a shul where people talk a lot, they all talk during Keriat HaTorah, and it takes too long. Let's switch to the older system, which is a triennial system, and we say less. We only say 1/3 of a parsha, and everyone was very happy with that. Yeah, let's do that. Let's go ahead and do that. The problem was in 1845 that nobody really knew what the triennial system was. There were some clues, but they had to develop and invent their own system. Like it didn't catch on right away. And to add to the misery, it was ingrained in people's brains that, Sukkot time, you begin at the end of Sukkot, you begin Simchas Torah, and you begin Bereshis, the next parsha is Noach, and summertime is Balak and Chukas, and wintertime you have Parsha Shemais, and then Pesach time you have X. It was ingrained in people's seasons in their heads what the Parshas of Shavuot were. It was very difficult for many congregations to switch to a true triennial system because it just wouldn't align anymore. You're doing 1/3 of a parsha, and you're just on a completely different calendar than everybody else. And therefore, the adoption of this was kind of slow and clunky. They all agreed it was a problem. And if you honestly, I'll just interject here. My personal opinion is that the Misha Berachs and the futz, what I would call the futzing around that happens during the Ben Gavra Legavra, when you have people who will simply talk, and the Gabbai will add extra brachas, the Misha Berachs and Agaimels, all those things add to the length it takes to do Kriyas HaTorah, the donations. I think those are the main problem. But if you read quickly and you have a good Baal Koreh, I don't think it really takes that much longer. But that's my personal opinion. Anyway, besides, let's get back to the history. What happened was that in 1893, there was in the late 1800s, there was a renewed fascination with the triennial cycle. Many scholars became fascinated with what this actually was. Can we reverse engineer what they did in the time of the Geonim and the Rishonim? And this began with scholarship from Dr. Adolf Buchler, who had some content from the Karaganiza, from the old Shul in Fustat, which kept this minhag. And finally, and then I think it was in 1930, Dr. Jacob Mann also began a series of books on reviving, I think it's called the Bible as Preached in the Old Synagogue. He did a tremendous amount of breathtaking work. He's literally, when you read this book from Jacob Mann, you're in awe at his scholarship, his knowledge of Tanakh backwards and forwards, his knowledge of Shas, Paiskim, and it's really unreal that the amount of both biblical criticism, manuscript. He had like a photographic memory for manuscripts. The amount of work that went into this was astonishing. Menachem Zulai also, in the early 1900s, began to work on the piyutim, as I discussed last week, and began to reconstruct things. Finally, in the 20th century, you had Yosef Heinemann and Ezra Fleischer contributing to the research, and finally Shlomo Naeh, who till this day also contributes to this research, as I'm sure that others do as well. If anybody wants a history of the research of triennial cycles, there was a young man named Aaron Marsh. He published his master's thesis on the historiography of the triennial cycle. If anyone's interested, it's a good summary. Regardless, a lot of work went into what it was to reverse engineer it. Now, in the 1960s and the 1970s and 80s, the conservative movement had a critical study. There was this committee for the Jewish Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards. The Committee on Jewish Laws and Standards in 1988, which came together to try to establish exactly what a triennial cycle should be. Essentially, The Reform congregations in England developed their own. I believe. I believe what they would do is every year they would follow the annual cycle, right? In England. I think they still do this to this day. They follow the Nusach HaBavli, just like we do, the same way. After Simchas Torah, they do Bereshis, Nayach Lecha B'Yera, but every year they do a different third. They do the first third, second third. The first year they do the first third, second year they do the second third, and the third year they do the third third. In American Reform congregations, because they're much more liberal, they will very often just do a selection of the text. They'll read whatever the rabbi is interested in reading that week, and then he or she will give a sermon on that text that they read. I'm no expert in Reform or conservative synagogues, but according to Dr. Rabbi Larry Hoffman, he says that in America today, the conservative synagogues, most of them just do the normal, the normal Nusach HaBavli, the normal cycle, the annual cycle, and they read the whole thing. Very few Reform congregations will do that very deliberate triennial cycle. In practice, most people are doing the annual cycle, and essentially this is part of the trend today in conservative synagogues to move towards a more orthodox style of Nusach HaTefillah, simply because it seems to work better. Regardless, in 1988, Dr. Lionel Moses of the CJLS, of the conservative movement, published a long tshuva, as well as Elliot Dorff, with all of their thoughts on what they believed would be a halachically appropriate triennial cycle. There were conservative organizations doing something, or congregations, I should say, that were doing a triennial cycle that was halachically problematic. Like if you run under the assumption that it should be mutter to use a triennial cycle, which based on the Mishnah, Tosefta, Gemara, it should be. I mean, it should be mutter. It was done until the 13th century, so it's mutter. It's just not minhag Yisrael. But if you run under the assumption that you're yaitzeh with that and it's mutter, then there's also other halachic constructs there, like ein medalgim b'Torah, and starting with and ending off with divrei bracha, and all different kinds of constraints, and how many psukim you should do. There's all sorts of other halachic considerations, and so they developed that in that article, and they published their own, I should say, recommended cycle. Now, in the history of triennial cycles, we have so many numbers. We have 154, 167, 141 sidras, right? It's a very complex study to understand how many sidrot there actually were. And according to Yosef Heinemann, there actually wasn't ever, originally, I should say, in the time of the Amoraim, there was never a fixed sidrot. That was a later construction. Like, yeah, they did it roughly every 3 years, but it was not like, oh, we have 154 and we say from this pasuk to that pasuk, this pasuk to that pasuk. In Eretz Yisrael, they were more fluid about it. They did about 1/3 of a parsha every week. And it wasn't until the influence of the yeshivot in Bavel that the yeshivot in Eretz Yisrael began making it very official. And they began adding these deliberate stops and sidrot where they'd put into their chumash, like, this is where the sidra starts, this is where the sidra ends, and this is the week we do this sidra, and this is the week we do that sidra. So apparently there were shiftings over the centuries for how the sidrot should work and how the triennial cycle should be practiced at all. And we find the shifting in the past 200 years happening all over again. Different congregations having their own systems for the triennial cycle, and various shiftings happening as well. If you're interested, Hebcal, HebrewCalendar.com, I think it's HEBCAL.com. They actually will put both the annual cycle, the regular Keriat HaTorah, and the Hebrew calendar will also give you the triennial readings depending on which congregation you do. If you're a Reform congregation, a conservative congregation, they still provide this. Now, I've never been to a Reform or conservative service. I don't know what it's like. But according to Rabbi Hoffman, he says that that this is rarely practiced today, and most of the congregations will do something more similar to an annual cycle. I did see that the UK Reform does publish a deliberate cycle every couple of years so that everybody should know what they are going to do in their synagogue that year. With that, I think we will complete our study of how the Keriat HaTorah has changed or not changed in the past 500 years. In the Orthodox synagogues, for the most part, the bones of the system are very much identical. And I will look over the sources, God willing, this coming week. And there's a lot to consider when we talk about the liturgy that's said when you open the Heichal and when we take out the Sefer Torah, because there's quite a few things there besides the Berich HaTorah and the Misha Berachs. There's the Yikumpur Khan on Shabbat. There's Berich Shemeih. There's Ve'ivitzo Aaron, Lechashem Agdula, Shema Yisrael, some people do. There's a lot to study there, and I'm looking for a narrative, so to speak. I'm trying to find a narrative, different anecdotes. If anybody wants to provide me with some anecdotes that they have for how this tefillah has evolved, I'm searching. I do want to see if I can make this a study which is worth hearing and a history worth hearing, because it's important, and the study of how the exact Sidurim evolved is important. But I'm not sure how I could command everyone's attention with a deep dive analysis of which pasuk goes where. Like, should we say like it's difficult. We'd have to build tables and show everybody exactly which pasukim were said in which century and which half century and all that. So if anybody has input on that and how deep we should go, I'd be interested in hearing. I hope to give it one more last year on Keriat HaTorah. If it's not possible, it's not possible. And then we will continue next week, Bezrat Hashem.